The reason that we have such a massive issue with anxiety in our culture is we don't face our own mortality. Time's always closing in.
I found myself in Old Blighty hunting down some cherries for my dinner guest, Sean Tucker.
I want to be whole. I want to have dark and light.
Sean is a photographer, author, and philosopher, and even used to be a pastor. Not the Italian dish, the congregational type. This is Last Meal, where I prepare the dish my guest would want if it were their last.
Sean, welcome to Last Meal.
Thanks for having me.
For anyone at home that doesn't know who you are and why I'm speaking to you, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I can tell you about myself. I'm not sure why you're speaking to me, but I can tell you. I'm a photographer, filmmaker, and author. I suppose it's like the mix of things I do. So I do a mix of things. Taking images for myself is one of them. Going out in the streets and making portraits is the other side of that. And then the filmmaking side, it gets housed on a YouTube channel where people come and listen to me either teach sometimes technically about photography, some tutorials, or I do little documentaries on other photographers and their kind of process and what motivates them. And then quite a significant part of it is me pontificating from a sofa for a while because I like the kind of philosophical side of the creative journey. And just a few years ago, I read a book about that side of things too, the philosophy of creativity. So that's my day job now.
And that's actually how I discovered you,
Right.
because my foray into photography maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and I was hungry for content of how to shape light and everything like that. And I remember coming across your channel and liking it more than any of the others, not just for its technical know-how, but the fact that you seem to be quite a philosophical individual and had a lot to say about life as well as photography. And that's why you're sitting here.
Great.
Just for me to answer that question for you.
It's a good answer. Yeah.
So if the world was ending tomorrow, your last meal would be
Oh, well played. That's right.
pancakes jubilee.
Yeah.
Now, when you told me about this, you actually said cherry pancakes, and it was from a memory that you had when you were young. The jubilee part was something that I found due to research that I did about these little roadside cafes called Little Chefs in Britain. Can you tell me about going to those when you were a kid?
Yeah, I mean, the time in my life it really sticks out was I would have been about 8 or 9 years old probably. And it was a tough time for me as a kid because my dad had left when I was about 4 and my mom had remarried. And there was kind of this new family for me with my mom and my stepdad, and my sister had just been born as well. And I think my brother and I, now that we compare notes later in life, we both felt a little bit on the outside of things. We were about to be shipped off to boarding schools. And I just remember being a difficult time in my life. And I think something I've learned is like when things get really difficult, sometimes you focus on the tiny things you can get out of life, the little joys. And one of the little joys for me was when we used to drive around the UK, there were these little they were kind of like diners. And one of the things they had and I've forgotten they were called Pancakes Jubilee. You found that out. And that twigged a memory. It's like we used to go in. That was the first thing I'd order. I've always had an obsession with anything cherry flavored for some reason. I found out years later, my dad has the same thing, my biological dad. So it's obviously been passed on. But those, cherry pancakes would be like a little light spot in an otherwise pretty dark chapter.
I know that you went to boarding school. Tell me about that.
Boarding school in the UK was okay. It was fairly innocuous, I suppose, but South Africa was tough. Going to high school in South Africa was a lot of bullying. There was a phase where I went from this, because school in the UK finishes in August, but it only starts and it runs January to December in South Africa. So there was this 5-6 month gap before the next year started. But my parents decided just stick him in the same year he was in for 6 months, he can acclimatize. But because I joined a boarding school, it was an all boys boarding school in rough and tumble South Africa. And I was a very skinny blonde kid with a very British accent. I was targeted. I had to get pulled out of that school after 2 months because the bullying got so bad. I was hung out of 3rd-story windows and beaten up every night, and it was really rough. It was really rough. And then the next year went to a different high school, which in a lot of ways was rough too. But because we were all together and started together, there was this community that formed with the year that I was part of that intake. And so we kind of, suffering together is better than suffering alone. And I felt like, because we could kind of handle what was going on between us by sharing that with us, and I wasn't on my own, it was more doable. It wasn't necessarily better, the stuff that was going on, but because you had a community around you who were going through the same, it was more doable. Yeah.
Do you feel like you're part of any communities now?
No, and it's almost by choice. It's almost a little bit by choice. I mean, I worked for the church for years in South Africa, so that was a big part of my career, was being a pastor through all my 20s. And I think I, at some point, got a bit disillusioned with community, especially when you sort of go in on the deep end with it. And I think I'm kind of licking my wounds a bit still years later with that, because what happened was, I joined this institution because I believed I could make a difference and do some good work there. But as my ideas evolved and I started to speak out honestly, that was obviously a problem, because you need to toe the line. And so I was fired eventually for not saying what you need to say, and asking too many questions was definitely part of the reason. And
What were you speaking out about?
particularly with the last church, and this happened a few times, so it's a long story. Particularly with the last church, it was a few different things. One was I was very vocal about the fact that we were pretty hypocritical when it came to how we treated the poor, for example. So in South Africa, there, especially around this 2008, 2009 period, there were a lot of xenophobic attacks, and then they would kick off like wildfire. It was almost orchestrated. There'd be some kind of signal that would go out, and suddenly in all the local townships, the poorer communities, Somalians who'd come over for work or Angolans would be dragged out in the streets and beaten to death, and shops would be burned down. So I'd said to the church, when one of these kicked off in 2009, I said, we need to get in there and get people out. And they said, well, we can't do that because they might mess up the church bus, which I just thought, is like, what are we doing? Like, why are we doing this? Like, we say we believe all this stuff about how we should be helping other people, and we're not. So I stole the bus, obviously, and I went in and I...
Excuse me?
Yeah, but I
That's
took people...
amazing.
And we bust people out all day, but we couldn't take them to the church because they'd mess up the furniture, right? So I had to bust them to local school halls where people were taking care of them. And that to me was a break point for me. I mean, it'd been coming for a long time. There were lots of little things. That last church installed spikes outside the front door so homeless people couldn't shelter in the rain. And then we'd stand up on a Sunday and talk about how we should take care of the poor in our community. Or we'd run soup kitchens. I had a big group of young adults who'd run soup kitchens, help people get ID books and get into work, but I wasn't allowed to bring them to services, these people who we were dealing with on the street. And I just couldn't handle the hypocrisy of it. So I started standing up and getting quite vocal about it, and was basically told, you need to shut up or go. So I said, well, you're going to have to kick me out, which they happily did. So
Did it challenge your commitment to religion in any way, or are you still religious?
Religion's a tough word. Like I would say I'm definitely still spiritual and spiritually inclined and seeking. I definitely have a faith. It's not a neat faith, and it's full of way more question marks than certainties. But it's important to me, and I definitely want to read as widely as possible and keep building on that and exploring that for myself. That's really important. I mean, yeah, religious usually sort of talks about, again, like joining a group, joining an institution, but I know how fractious that can be now. And that for me at that time was losing not just a job, it was losing friends, proper community, the people who I thought cared about me, who had to turn and kick me out as well, because you have to side with the institution. So I'm a lot more careful now about what I actually join or say that I'm a part of or put a label on. I mean, the best kind of redefining of religion I hear, which I do like, is that the suggestion is it comes from the Latin ligare, which means to connect or bind. It's where we get ligament from, the word ligament. So it's this idea of re-ligare, or remaking broken connections. So if something in the world is broken, if our relationship between nations or between people or between us and the environment is broken, it's our job, good religion's job, if we have a spirituality, to remake those broken connections and fix things. So that if I define it like that, yeah, I'm still religious, but most people, that's not the definition.
So how do you define success?
It's what kind of dent I make with the things I really care about, and that's it's more legacy stuff, I suppose. There's a quote that I reference in the book I wrote from a guy named, he's a pastor in America, named Frederick Buechner, and it's slightly religious in language, but you get the idea. He basically says the place God calls you to is the place where your deep joy and the world's deep hunger meet. So it's this idea of finding that thing that brings you a lot of joy, which for me is...
But intersects with purpose, I'm guessing.
Exactly, but somehow it makes a dent in somewhere that you see the world is hungry. And it doesn't have to literally be hunger. For me, I know what it is. I've had family members and people in my life who've really struggled with mental health, especially anxiety. So I know for me, I want to take the things that bring me deep joy, which are things like photography, filmmaking, writing, and a bunch of others. And I want to find ways that I can put work out into the world that when it hits the right people at the right time, it lowers the anxiety for them. And that's when I get those emails coming back to me, that's success. Like I've got metrics attached to the stuff I do online, and people look at things like numbers of subscribers or likes or things on social media. That's success. I couldn't care less. It's the 1 or 2 emails I'll get a month from somebody who shares their story and goes, I was really battling. I didn't know how to move forward. I was crippled with anxiety. Something you said in this video or something you said in this book really helped me to kind of get a handle on it and realize it's okay and I can keep going a little bit longer. Like those will keep me fueled for a year, just one of those emails. So that feels like success and feels like after I'm gone, if I've made little dents in the world in those ways, I don't know where those fan out to and what kind of difference they ultimately make, the ripples in the pond stuff. But that's the stuff I'm aiming for.
And is that what motivated you to make all of your videos while they're about photography a lot more philosophical?
Yeah.
Like the Trojan horse
kind
of style?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the joke in my family is like, the only reason I started a YouTube channel was so I could keep preaching. And it's not untrue. Right. I mean, the reason I joined the church is because I mostly work with young people, so 35-year-olds and under, but it was to stand up and speak to them and say, listen, I know life's tough and I know things can be confusing, but let's talk about it and see people get a little bit of hope for another day to try something else and to keep going. Like those were the things that fueled me. So when I sidestepped and took a few years to build up photography, and then I thought, hang on a minute, I can make videos about this and share photography. I initially made 3 videos that taught you how to shoot large products in a studio, super dry tutorials. They're still on my channel, but I just realized when I look back at them, I don't care about this. I don't want to do that at all. And then the next one, I made a video on the fact that I was burning out at work, something that was super relatable. I took myself off to Snowdonia to take landscape photographs, and I'm not a landscape photographer, so I was totally out of my depth. It wasn't a tutorial because I have no expertise, but it was just an honest little video diary about when we hit the wall with something, maybe it's time to sidestep, become a beginner again in something, start learning because that's an exciting phase, and then maybe that helps you fall in love with the whole medium again. And that video got a completely different quality of response, and I knew, okay, I'm back to what I used to do. I found a way to keep talking to people in a way that helps them get a handle on their lives.
I heard you once talking about how, we can sometimes just blame the tools all the time, but the thing that we need to remember is that we're working with better equipment than the greatest photographers of all time had when they took the greatest photos. And I saw this again, like a fantastic analogy for life, because we're constantly complaining about modern conveniences and things that we have available to us without appreciating and living in the moment. I mean, I remember I was staying in an Airbnb before this, and the internet was rubbish. And I was sitting there trying to upload files, and it was taking me twice as long as it normally would.
Yeah.
It was like the end of my world. I was like cursing it out, the whole thing. But I'm like, hang on a second. I have internet in an Airbnb where everything's fine. Yeah. It's just going to take a little bit slower.
Yeah.
And, I catch myself doing this all the time. I think we're all guilty of it from time to time, is we're so immersed in fortune that we take it for granted immediately and often blame it when it's not the thing to blame. Or we're creating that sense inside of ourselves of anger or frustration or not feeling good enough or whatever it may be. Can you talk more about that and how
the opposite of that could lead to a life well lived?
The antidote is a bit of honesty, and it's a bit of self-awareness, and it's being honest with ourselves and understand that the frustration we have, which is legit, is more a fear of failure, a fear of not being able to make anything significant with the time and energy we're putting into things, that we're falling behind other people who do what we do. It's all those things that actually is where it's coming from, which is why people seem so unnecessarily angry at something like a lens. It's just like, whoa, that's a lot of feeling for an inanimate object. It's all that stuff that's getting backed up in there. They're just angry about life. It's not working out, you know? Yeah. So I think in terms of life, I think it's often much easier to point and get frustrated at the surface details of our lives as well. And the fact that what we're probably dealing with is the same stuff. Fear that we're falling behind our peers, fear that we're not relevant, that we're not making a difference, that our lives are meaningless. Those are the things that really make us afraid. And that time's always closing in. Like, we don't have infinite time. We've got one life to do it. Like, that's a time crunch and a fear that we don't often put into that starker contrast. But if we do more often, I think it again lowers that anxiety, which pops out and points fingers at stupid details around us just to offset it a little bit. The problem is when we do that, it doesn't actually lower the anxiety because we haven't even taken a look at what it's about. I'm reading a book at the moment by Ernst Becker called The Denial of Death, a guy writing in the 70s who was talking a lot about the reason that we have such a massive issue with anxiety in our culture. One of them is we don't face our own mortality. We squash it. We put it away. I mean, we were walking around graveyards yesterday, and they're all overgrown. They're all sort of stuck away around the back of churches. It used to be that you had to. It was law to go to church every Sunday in this country 300 years ago, which meant that you walk through the gravestones of your ancestors. You're faced with the fact that this time is short. You don't know how long you're going to be here, which made you more comfortable with it because it was more a present consciousness. And I think probably that particular anxiety wasn't as bad as it is now, where we're all pretending it doesn't happen and we can extend our lives and there's no problem really. And it pops out instead, that fear, that anxiety pops out and points fingers at weird stuff. I think it's something like that.
You know how people say, live every day like it's your last?
Sure.
I think this is a ridiculous thing to say.
Yeah, right? Because my last day, I'm just running around screaming. Exactly, yeah.
Well, here's a question. If you were told you had 1 week left to live, and it wasn't the end of the world, like it wasn't an asteroid or something like that, you had cancer or something like that, you had 1 week to go, what would you do with that time?
Spend time with loved ones. I think we all would. It's a really simple one for me. I close everything down that I do because it doesn't matter anymore. I think the difference that I've made is the difference I've made. I'm not going to be able to do, something groundbreaking in that time. Maybe I'd write something in that time that just sort of puts something out to the world at the end for whatever those thoughts were. But spend time with loved ones. It's a really easy one.
If you were to write something, it would be a journal that could be like something to remember you by, a legacy of sorts, or your final thoughts?
I think it would more be because it's a very rare position for a human being to be in. If you know that you have a week to live, that's a very rare perspective that we don't have a lot of access to, and I think that's a gift you can give. I find those fascinating to read. What did people who could see the end coming, what were their last thoughts? What did they write? What did they think was important at the very end? So what you're asking me now, I think I'd write something like that. It would be like, now that it's done and I have nothing more to do, this is what I think. And I have no idea what would come out, but that would be interesting to leave behind, I think.
You are a very self-aware person, I've noticed. And a lot of the time, having a decent philosophy of life, I think, needs to be grounded in this kind of candid self-audit of your own strengths, weaknesses, and also your own tendencies. Because a lot of the things that I hear you say are steeped in a deep knowledge of yourself. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who doesn't feel like they know themselves as well as you might?
The biggest help for me has been what Jung calls integrating the shadow. So we all have, he sort of talked about our psyche as sort of split up into layers, basically, conscious, subconscious, but at the top of that conscious is your persona. And that's the person that you put on for the world. You want them to like you, so you're going to display that person everywhere you go. The shadow is its antithesis at the bottom in that subconscious. It's the dark side of you that you repress, that you keep hidden from everyone because you're afraid of not being accepted. And I think for me, the biggest breakthrough for self-awareness was And this was difficult for my personality type because my personality is a perfectionist. I want to be beyond reproach. I don't want anybody to be able to criticize me. But getting to that point where, and sort of reading a bit of Jung with some of this, but that we all have that shadow. And he has this quote which really stuck in my head, which was, "I'd rather be whole than good." And I'm obsessed with being seen as good and right about everything. But the more I thought about that, that I want to be whole. I want to have dark and light. I always equate it to photography. If I take an image that's all light, it's a white piece of paper. It's not interesting. You have to have the shadows to tell a good story. It has to be the mix of the both to say something worthwhile. And embracing that shadow part and saying, this is also a part of me, means that I start going in and getting honest about my failings, about where I'm not a good human being or where my impulses are not good and I need to look at those. And the minute you do that, you start to you drag that shadow out into the light and look at it honestly. The fear for going inwards goes away because you got the bad stuff. So you realize there's not as much in there that I need to be afraid of anymore. In which case, going in regularly and doing a bit of a look around becomes far less terrifying. It's why so many of us are afraid to be stuck in a room on our own, because everything starts to surface, doesn't it? All starts to come up in the back of our mind, like who we really are. We're faced with questions. We're terrified to be on our own. The more you do that shadow work, though, for me, the less fear you have about being left alone with yourself and going and digging when you need to and getting honest about things. And that's not to say I know myself perfectly. I've got a long way to go. But just that as a practice means I'm less afraid of that process. So whatever else needs to get uncovered, hopefully I've got the guts to go and do it next time and when something else comes up.
This might be a stretch, but is this why a lot of your photography works with shadows?
Well, it was funny because that happened separately, but they've become linked together.
Wow.
I did 2 videos as a series years ago. I basically showed people, how I take the images I do in terms of that very contrasty light and shadow stuff. And the shadows are very dark and very rich in a lot of the images. I just thought it was a cool aesthetic thing to do. That's where it started. I was shooting. I was shooting like a graphic designer, playing with shapes that shadows created. But then I started to think, how am I doing that technically? Well, on the one side, I'm taking a technique from filmmaking, which is you protect your highlights. If you watch a film, you'll never see a blown out sky. You can always see the cloud details, which means that's their ceiling. You start by protecting all the highlights and then let everything else fall dark below that, which means you're going to create some very dark shadows, which you then need to bring lights in if you want to fill them. You can't work the other way around, because if you blow your sky, you're never getting it back, especially on digital. So that was the technique. So it was this protect your highlights and embrace your shadows. And then I started talking about this embrace your shadows video. This is the technique that I use, and went, yeah, that's kind of how I think about life, that you embrace your shadows. You take those dark parts and you use them to tell a good story and shape you as a person as well, because it's the tough stuff, the dark stuff we go through that forges us the most into who we end up being. So shadows, if you let them, if you're not going to be so afraid of them, are your friends.
What is a lesson that, had you learnt it earlier in life, would have changed the trajectory?
I don't regret the trajectory, even though it's been messy, but I think maybe the pace. If I told myself things take longer than I think they do, if I'd learned that lesson early, I think I would have enjoyed the journey more, and ironically might have moved faster. I think I wasted time by being so over anxious to put things out into the world that got feedback, because I needed validation as a human being. I pushed things too fast. I rushed them, and then I had to back out, and I probably killed too many things that might have had life if I was kinder to myself and had a bit more patience. I think that's something I could have learned early on.
What is a belief that you hold with which many people disagree?
Oof. I think it'd be cancelled. It comes very, very quick story. It comes from when I was at seminary, and this has stuck with me for years. One of the past students came back and preached a sermon at seminary while I was there, and this was before social media. And the title of his sermon, I still remember now, was basically he was saying that the problem with the next generation is going to be an obsession with their own pain. And I think that he was quite prescient with that. And I think one of the things, I think we've over-calibrated now. We went through generations where we ignored our own pain and no one talked about mental health and no one talked about issues. And now we're very aware of it, and that's a great thing. I mean, I told you one of my big things is trying to make a dent in anxiety for people. But I think it's fed into something where we've forgotten that some level of human negative emotion is good and normal and human. It's what we should have. And I think we've over-calibrated. And we've become obsessed with our own pain where it cripples us. Not people who actually have serious issues, obviously, because they're out there. But just day to day, I think we take those negative human emotions and we allow them to shut our lives down instead of going, it's okay that I feel anxious today to some degree. It's okay that I'm sad because something bad happened to me. That's okay. That's normal. And I can keep going and just accept that that's a part of the color of life. It's okay. And how will you ever grow as a human being if you don't take those negative emotions and instead of shutting down, push through where you can? Because that's what forges us, the not giving up, the pushing through, the trying to grow through it. And that takes a presence that says, this emotion now is not all there is. It's just something I have to work with instead of shutting it down and going, I'll be available next week. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I'll be available. Yeah. What is the most sensible thing you've ever heard anyone say?
I don't know if I have a most sensible of all time, but like I've got a recent one that I thought was really helpful. It was to do with writing, actually. That's become a bit of a life philosophy thing as well. And the advice was never edit and flow in the same session, which I think is really good. And when I thought about it, it's so obvious. But when you've got things to say, just pour your heart out and don't try and make it neat. And on days when you don't have anything to say, go back and tidy up what you said yesterday. And I think there's something to that that's quite, we're all trying to self-edit all the time and we're being super, super careful. And maybe some of that's good, right? Because we say stupid stuff all the time. But I think that's good. The fact that we can acknowledge there's different modes. Sometimes we just have to get something out and sometimes we can go clean it up. That was pretty sensible.
What is one thing that you would like to be remembered for?
I suppose it comes back a little bit to that mission statement. For me, having made a dent with what I do and helping people get a little handle on their lives, I'd love that. I don't know how specific that is. And it's interesting because I can track back those little bits of difference I've managed to make as a photographer. And then if I jump back 10 years in the church, and then if I jump back before that, studying psychology and trying to help with that, there's lots of ways along the road. I care less whether people remember me for having taken amazing images or written a book or what I used to do in the church or whatever I'm going to do next. I care that thread runs through the whole thing of, with whatever he did, people seem to find that comforting and help them get a handle on things. That'd be good.
And finally, before I've kept you here so long, the fucking ice cream's good. So we've got more of it, Doris. Of anyone living today, whose last meal would you like to know?
Oh, living today. Oh gosh. My favorite spiritual author is a Franciscan friar in the States named Richard Rohr. I reckon I'd be interested to see what he picks.
He's still around?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just.
We'll try and reach out to him.
No, so you've got to do it.
Yeah.
You've got to do it. You'd have a fascinating conversation with him.
Okay.
Amazing, yeah.
Well, Sean Tucker, thank you for coming on Last Meal. I'm going to get you some more ice cream and then you can tuck in.
Cheers.
Pleasure.
It's been great. Thank you. Yeah.
Tonight, I walk away with a completely refreshed perspective on Sean's art form. None of us are ideal or complete, and although we may strive to be or do better, that process can never start without first recognizing that within us which has been suppressed, to embrace and master our own shadows. And that's all from me.